Ghosts of Cairo. The now faded city of Cairo is located at the southernmost tip of Illinois, at the convergence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Once a place of glory and commerce, Cairo has become a shadow of its former self. There is no question, however, that it has earned a place in the annals of southern Illinois when it comes to both history and hauntings. Illinois' southernmost point was first visited by Father Louis Hennepin, a French missionary and explorer, in March 1660. He and his party stayed for a very short time before continuing on down the Mississippi. He noted in his journals that the banks of the river are so muddy and so full of rushes and reeds that we had much to do to find a place to go ashore. In 1699, another French priest, Father Jean-François de Saint-Cosme, visited the site for one night during the month of December. He also found the spot to be unremarkable and continued on his journey downriver. The site of Cairo was once again passed by during the explorations of Father François Regis in 1700. Another French explorer, Sieur Charles Juchereau de Saint-Denis, was slaughtered by Indians at the future site of Cairo while he and his men were preparing the hides of nearly 13,000 buffalo they had killed for shipment to France. But not everyone ignored the promise of the location. Settlers soon began to arrive at this confluence of the rivers, and over the years, it grew into a bright and shining town, despite the opinion of British author Charles Dickens, who visited the town in the 1840s and referred to it as a detestable morass and a grave uncheered by any gleam of promise. The city was chartered and laid out in 1837, and in 1840, work began on a levee, a shipyard, sawmills, an ironworks, a warehouse, and residential cottages. In 1854, the U.S. Congress named Cairo an official port of entry, making it part of the collection district of New Orleans. A surveyor of customs was appointed to inspect and collect fees after goods had passed through the port of entry. A few years later, in 1859, it was decided that Cairo needed a customs house, but no money was appropriated for this purpose before the Civil War broke out. Cairo struggled as a river town for a number of years until the Illinois Central Railroad opened up commercial traffic for the city to Chicago. In 1859 alone, Cairo shipped 6 million pounds of cotton and wool to the north, along with 7,000 barrels of molasses and 15,000 hogshead of sugar. When the Civil War began, Cairo was found to be one of the most important pieces of real estate in the country. During the fall and winter of 1861 and 1862, both the Union and the Confederacy began to realize the city's strategic importance. While most residents never really feared that Cairo would be invaded by the rebels, Governor Richard Yates was taking no chances and stated that he was omitting no preparation to be ready in case an attempt was to be made. Yates ordered a contingent of soldiers and artillery to Cairo soon after Fort Sumter had surrendered. By June, federal soldiers were in and around the city, as well as in Villa Ridge and Bird's Point, towns across the Mississippi and Ohio rivers in Missouri and Kentucky, respectively. In order to strengthen Cairo as a military camp and a naval base, Yates also sent 7,000 new guns, 6,000 rifled muskets, 500 rifles, and 14 artillery batteries to the city in the autumn of 1861. These additions made Cairo a formidable place, and the entire city became an enormous military camp with a huge parade ground and clusters of barracks on every side. Military protocol became the order of the day for the entire city and dominated the lives of its citizens for years to come. In spite of the advancements and the military buildup, Cairo was still at a disadvantage in many ways. Hemmed in by water on two sides, levees were built around the city, and while they protected Cairo from severe flooding, water still often managed to seep into the low, flat ground. There were no paved roads in those days, and so the entire area was almost always like a swamp. The only year-round access to the city was provided by the Illinois Central Railroad, which entered a causeway over the quagmire of water and mud north of town. Once within the city limits, the railroad split and ran in a loop along the levee and then joined again. Along this rail line came many divisions of soldiers that were destined to split the Confederacy by wreaking havoc all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Cairo quickly gained the attention of the entire country, drawing many reporters to observe the military buildup. The New York Times referred to Cairo as the Gibraltar of the West. Famous English novelist Anthony Trollope visited wartime Cairo in 1862 and wrote a dismal report on the city. He complained that the inhabitants seemed to revel in dirt, and noted that the sheds of soldiers are bad, comfortless, damp and cold. He also complained about the hotel accommodations there, especially the bathroom facilities. After the war ended, the future still seemed bright for Cairo. Despite continued flooding throughout the remainder of the century, the city was still reveling in its Civil War glory. New homes were built, new businesses established, and the customs house was finally built. It is believed that Stephen Douglas chose the location for the customs house, construction of which was begun in 1867 and completed in 1872. Sadly, though, things began to change in the late 1880s. It was at this time that politics brought about the end of Cairo's status as a port of entry. The customs house was closed and all business of that sort was moved to Paducah, Kentucky. For Cairo, this brought about the decline of river business even before most other ports on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. By the early 1900s, the railroad had all but replaced the rivers as the most efficient way to move goods and cargo. Thanks to the Illinois Central Railroad, Cairo was able to hang on longer than most towns, but soon railroads followed in the path of the riverboats, and by the 1950s, Cairo's final decline had begun. A trip to this old river town today would shock many who have traveled here even in the last decade or so. Visitors are tragically greeted by many crumbling buildings and boarded-up windows, making the place look far too much like a forgotten and desolate city that has been cut off from the outside world. But all is not lost here. There are still many hidden and haunted jewels in Cairo. You just need to know where to find them. Following the military expansion of Cairo, a fort was constructed at the apex of the heart-shaped city that consisted of a massive earthen mound fitted with 3 24-pound cannons and an 8-inch mortar. This placed the Union forces in full control of the rivers at their confluence. The earthwork was first named Fort Prentice, after Benjamin Mayberry Prentice, who had served honorably during the Mexican War. The name was later changed to that of Fort Defiance. For many years before the war, the site was guarded by one lone cannon that was only used on special occasions. One sizable building, a whiskey distillery, was located here, but soldiers tore it down as they cleared the way for the fort. When federal troops began arriving in the region at the start of the war, they had an immediate dislike for the place, and in short time this dislike would grow into revulsion. Cairo's climate was humid, disease-carrying mosquitoes and rats were everywhere, and operators of taverns and brothels cheated and even robbed many of the men. Perhaps worst of all, though, were the periodic floods, which even the levees could not completely halt. These floods decimated the town, turning its streets and the soldiers' encampments into a sea of mud. The only benefit to the abominable living conditions at Cairo was it encouraged the soldiers to train harder for an invasion of the South. In spite of the conditions, however, life at Camp Defiance was rigid but not intolerable. A regulation poster informed the troops that, after 8 p.m., there would be no loud singing, no cheering or firing arms. Soldiers were urged to attend Sabbath services in an orderly and Christian-like manner. Apparently, food was no problem. There were plenty of provisions, and locally grown fruit was plentiful. One soldier wrote to his wife that peaches were for sale every day in camp and that he had spent most of his money buying fruit. The fort was dismantled after the war ended, but the site was later taken over by the state of Illinois and turned into a park. It is within the grounds of the park that events from the past seem to be bleeding over into the present. According to local tradition, the ghosts of soldiers who once occupied these grounds are still being heard and experienced today. A number of witnesses claim that they have heard the sounds of men's voices and drum rolls being played in the darkness of the park at night. No explanation for these sounds has ever been adequately given. Near Cairo is one of the most widely known burial grounds in southern Illinois, the Mound City National Cemetery. Located about 6 miles north of Cairo, it was created by an act of Congress in 1862 as a burying ground for the bodies of soldiers who had been scattered in several smaller graveyards around the immediate region and in Kentucky. The removal of the bodies took about 2 years, and the cemetery continued to grow throughout the years of the Civil War. The grave markers here, as in all military cemeteries, are simple and uniform in appearance. They have only slight differences to indicate the branch of military and the time of service. There are also graves of Confederate soldiers here, as well as one Confederate spy, who remains nameless. There are also more than 2,700 Federal soldiers buried here who are also unknown. In addition to the men buried in the cemetery, there are also about 50 women, many of them nurses at the military hospital that was located in Mound City. There are also grave sites for many of the civilian workers from the hospital and shipyards in Mound City and Cairo. Near the center of the cemetery is a large granite memorial that carries assorted legends and the names of many of the dead. A short way to the south of this prominent marker is a less orderly section of the burial ground. One stone in this section marks the grave of Brigadier General John B. Turchin, the Mad Cossack, who was once an officer in the army of the Russian Tsar. His checkered career in the American military tells a story of an efficient, but eccentric, officer. His wife, who accompanied him throughout the war, despite regulations against it, is buried beside him. Many believe it is the general's wife who haunts this cemetery. Over the years, there have been many reports of a woman in white who wanders the grounds of the cemetery. She is most often seen near the section where General Turpin and his wife are buried. After the war ended, General Turpin went to live in southern Illinois' Washington County with his wife. They lived in fairly impoverished circumstances, but her devotion for him never faltered and she frequently visited his grave after his death. Some believe her ghost mourns here still, despite the fact that she joined him in death many years ago. In addition to this lonesome ghost, there may be others here, as well. Visitors sometimes recount hearing unexplained noises on the ground and seeing mysterious lights. An old caretaker's house stood empty and abandoned on the grounds for many years, but people often claimed to see lights burning in the windows. During each of these incidents, the house proved to be unoccupied. In the days when the steamships and riverboats were still journeying up and down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and the city of Cairo was still a leading port at their confluence, there were many imposing mansions built along the magnolia-shaded streets of the city. In a portion of town that has been dubbed Millionaire's Row, the wealthiest of Cairo's citizens constructed massive mansions with which to place their money and influence on display. Even today, these magnificent homes loom over a city whose glory has long since passed. The residents who built these places have passed on, but have all of them left? A number of these old homes boast otherworldly occupants, but none are as active as the legendary mansion known as Magnolia Manor. Without a doubt, the former Gallagher House remains the most famous building in the city. Construction was started on the house in 1869, following the Civil War, and it was completed 3 years later. The man who erected this imposing brick structure was Charles A. Gallagher, a leading citizen of Cairo during the war. Gallagher was a milling merchant who had accumulated a fortune selling flour for hardtack to the government. After the house was completed, it was widely admired for its architecture and location. The walls were constructed of double brick with a 10-inch space between them to keep out the dampness of the river regions. A high white fence was built to surround the grounds, and a number of magnolia trees were planted in the yard. The house became a social center during the 1870s, but the Gallagher Mansion reached the peak of its fame in April 1880, when former President Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia, were guests in the house for 2 days. This was not Grant's first visit to Cairo, nor was it the first time that he made the acquaintance of Charles Gallagher. Through business transactions with the military during the Civil War, Gallagher formed a friendship with General Grant, who had established a headquarters at the St. Charles Hotel in Cairo. As a guest of the Gallaghers, the Grants occupied the southeast bedroom on the second floor. The southwest bedroom was occupied by Mrs. Grant's packing cases of gifts and souvenirs that she had gathered on her recent world tour. Several receptions were held in the house during the Grants' visit, and afterward, they traveled north to Galena. In the years that followed, the Gallaghers continued to welcome guests into the mansion among the magnolias. In 1914, the house was acquired by Peter T. Langan, a well-known lumber dealer in Cairo, and he and his wife continued the tradition of hospitality that had been established by the Gallaghers. After his death, the house was sold to Colonel and Mrs. Fane W. King, who occupied the house until 1952. At that time, the house was taken over by the Cairo Historical Association, and it became the group's initial restoration effort. Thanks to the amazing condition of the home, as well as the visit by the Grants, it was entered on the National Register of Historic Places in 1969 as Magnolia Manor. The mansion is open today for tours by the general public, and many unsuspecting visitors to the house have encountered the ghosts that are said to linger there. According to a number of reports that have been collected in recent years, tourists claim to have not only spotted ghosts dressed in period clothing who are often mistaken for reenactors, but to have also heard the sounds of whispers, voices, and footsteps in empty rooms of the house. One woman described in detail how she and her family were visiting Magnolia Mansion and were followed down a staircase by heavy footsteps. The steps were so insistent and seemed so impatient to get past her and her young daughter that the woman stopped and stepped aside to let them pass. She was startled when she realized there was no one behind her. And it's not only visitors to the house who have strange encounters. Some of the staff members, volunteers, and former caretakers have had their own weird experiences. Several accounts tell of a young boy who has been seen in the mansion. One caretaker claimed he saw the boy, who looked to be between 3 or 4, in the house on 6 different occasions over a 2-year period. The boy is described as wearing a white shirt, dark pants, and suspenders, and having dark, tousled hair. He seems to be aware of the living people in the house, and when spotted, he runs away and vanishes into one of the rooms. A search of the room always reveals that he has disappeared. In addition, doors have been seen to open and close by themselves, and there have been frequent problems with staff members attempting to open doors that seem to be locked. No matter how hard they push on them, the doors refuse to open, as if someone was holding them shut from the other side. Moments later, the door swings open, usually under its own power. Also, one staff member told of frequently walking into the bedrooms in the morning, after the house has been locked up for the night, and finding the impression of a sleeping form left on the bed. She described the shape as the perfect size of a person, but there was no way that anyone could have gotten into the place while she was away. Even when she checked with other staffers, all of them denied any knowledge of the eerie impressions. So, is Magnolia Manor really haunted? That is up to the reader to decide, of course, but if you make it all of the way down to Cairo someday, be sure to put it on your list of places to visit. Haunted or not, it's a wonderful piece of Illinois history that has been remarkably preserved as a poignant reminder of a city that once was. The Millstadt Axe Murders. The small town of Millstadt is located just a few miles from Belleville, a long-established and prosperous southwestern Illinois city across the river from St. Louis. Millstadt has always been known as a quiet community. It was settled long ago by German immigrants who came to America to work hard, be industrious, and keep to themselves. It was a place where nothing bad could ever really happen, or at least that's what the residents there in the latter part of the 1800s believed. The murders that occurred on Saxtown Road, however, forever shattered that illusion. When a local German family was brutally slaughtered in 1874, it created a dark, unsolved mystery, and a haunting that still continues to be experienced today. On March 19, 1874, Carl Stelzenried, age 70, his son, Frederick, 35, Frederick's wife, Anna, 28, and their children, Carl, 3, and Anna, 8 months, were found brutally murdered in their home on Saxton Road, located outside of Millstadt. The grisly crime was discovered by a neighbor, Benjamin Schneider, who had arrived at the Stelzenried home early that morning to collect some potato seeds from Carl Stelzenried. As he approached the home, he found that the area was eerily still. The horses and cattle that were fenced in the front lot had not been watered or fed, and no one was taking care of the morning chores. Schneider knocked on the front door, but no one answered. He called out and looked in the window, but it was too dark inside the house for him to see anything. Finally, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. As he stepped in, he looked down and saw the body of Frederick Stelzenried lying in a large pool of blood on the floor. The young man had been savagely beaten, and his throat had been cut. 3 of his fingers had been severed. Panicked, Schneider began looking for the other members of the family. He found Anna and her children lying on a bed. All of them had been bludgeoned to death, and Anna's throat had been cut. Her infant daughter, baby Anna, was lying across her chest, her small arms wrapped around her mother's neck. Her son, Carl, was found next to her. His facial features were unrecognizable because of the brutal blows that he had sustained to his head. All 3 of them had apparently been murdered as they slept. In a separate bedroom, Schneider found Carl Stelzenried. He had been struck so many times, apparently with an axe, that he was nearly decapitated. His body was sprawled on the blood-stained floor, and it was later surmised that he had been roused from his bed by noises in the house and been struck down as he attempted to come to the aid of his family. The only survivor of the carnage was the family's German shepherd, Monk. He was found lying on the floor next to Anna Stelzenried's bed, keeping watch over the bodies of Anna and the children. Monk was known to be very protective of the family and downright vicious toward strangers. This fact would lead investigators to believe that the killer, or killers, was someone known to the family. Schneider quickly left and summoned help. The authorities called to nearby Belleville for assistance, and several sheriff's deputies and detectives answered the call. Soon after arriving, Deputy Sheriff Hughes discovered footsteps leading away from the house. As they were examined, it was noted that the prints had been made by boots cobbled with heavy nails, making them very distinctive. Hughes also found indentions in the ground that looked as though they had been made by someone dragging a heavy axe. He followed the tracks for about a mile, and at the end of the trail, he found a pouch of partially chewed tobacco covered with blood. He deduced that the killer had been wounded during his attack on the family and had attempted to stem the bleeding with chewing tobacco, a popular folk remedy that was believed to draw the infection from a cut. The footprints in the bloody tobacco pouch led the police to the home of Frederick Boltz, the brother-in-law of Frederick Stelzenried. Boltz was married to Anna Stelzenried's sister, and there had been trouble between Boltz and Frederick Stelzenried because of $200 that Boltz had borrowed and never repaid. Bolts was friends with an itinerant farm worker named John Afkin, who had once worked for the Stelzenried family and who also harbored a grudge against Frederick. Afkin was a large and powerful man who made his living as a grubber, a back-breaking occupation that involved clearing trees and rocks from farm lots. He was considered an expert with an axe, as well as other hand tools, and was feared by many because of his quick temper. He also possessed another characteristic that was of interest to the investigators: he had a full head of light red hair. Karl Stelzenried had died clutching a handful of hair that was exactly the same color. Ladies from the Zion United Church of Christ in Millstadt prepared the bodies of the Stelzenried family for burial. This gruesome task was carried out in the Stelzenried barn, which still stands on the property today. The corpses were in such horrific condition that a number of the women became sick while washing them and had to be relieved. The killer had savaged the bodies so badly with his axe that the adults were nearly decapitated and the children were bloodied and pummeled beyond recognition. It was brutality like nothing these small-town folks had ever seen before. The family was laid to rest on Sunday, March 22nd, at FLYOVER Cemetery, located just a few miles from their home on Saxtown Road. The news of the horror spread across the region in newspaper accounts and even appeared on the front page of the New York Times. The terror and curiosity that gripped the area brought more than 1,000 people to the Stelzenried's funeral service. Immediately after the burial, Deputy Hughes arrested Frederick Bolts and John Afkin on suspicion of murder. The two men were brought before a grand jury in April 1874, but the jury was unable to indict them. They believed there was insufficient evidence to connect them to the murders. Both suspects were released a week later. Although the authorities had been unable to indict their main suspects in the case, the investigation into the two men's activities and motives did not come to an end. Investigators believed more strongly than ever that Bolts was somehow involved in the murders based on the fact that the cash and valuables inside of the Stelzenried house had been undisturbed. They believed there was a darker motive for the crime than mere robbery, and that Bolts was definitely involved. Just a few days before he was killed, on March 16th, Frederick Stelzenried confided to some friends and neighbors that he had just received a substantial inheritance from relatives in Germany. He was at an auction at the time he broke the news and was seen carrying a large willow basket covered with an oilcloth. Rumor had it that the basket contained the inheritance, which Frederick had collected at the bank just before attending the auction. The Stelzenried estate was reportedly worth several $1,000s at the time of the murder. Investigators surmised that the wholesale slaughter of the family might have been an attempt to wipe out all of the immediate heirs to the estate. They believed that Frederick Bolts, motivated by his dislike for Frederick Stelzenried and his belief that he would inherit the money because of his marriage to Anna's sister, had hired John Afkin to commit the murders. It was a viable theory behind the massacre, but the police were never able to make it stick. Bolts later brought suit against the Stelzenried estate in an effort to collect whatever money he could. He was eventually awarded $400, and soon after, he and his family moved away from the area and vanished into history. John Afkin remained in the Millstadt area, and legend has it that he was often seen carrying a gold pocket watch. When asked where he had gotten such an impressive timepiece, because it seemed much nicer than anything he could afford, Afkin would only smile. Some whispered that the pocket watch looked exactly like one that Karl Stelzenried once owned. The Stelzenried home was torn down in August 1954, but the land where it once stood is said to be haunted. A former owner of a house that was later built on the property stated that he and his wife were often awakened by strange noises around the anniversary of the murders, March 19th. They also both heard the sounds of doors opening and closing in the house, although nothing was ever found to be disturbed. A tenant who moved into the house in the early 1990s also had chilling experiences, including hearing knocking on the front door of the house and footsteps going up and down the stairs to the basement. Startled by the sounds, he quickly checked the front door and the basement stairs but found no sign of visitors or intruders. The next day, he shared his story with the former owner, asking him about the anniversary of the Stelzenried murders. The other man confirmed it for him. The ghostly happenings had taken place on March 19th, the anniversary of the murders. To this day, the slaughter of the Stelzenried family remains unsolved. While many suspects have been suggested over the years, there is no clear answer to the mystery. The area where the house once stood along Saxtown Road has changed very little since 1874, and it's not hard to imagine the sheer terror of those who lived nearby after news of the murders began to spread. It's a lonely, isolated area, and if the stories are to be believed, it's also a haunted one. But what ghosts still walk in this place? Are they the tragic spirits of the Stelzenrieds, still mourning the fact that their deaths have never been avenged? Or do the phantom footsteps and spectral knockings signal the presence of the killer's wicked wraith, perhaps forced to remain here as a penance for the crime that he never answered to while among the living? We may never really know, but for now, the haunting continues and the people of Millstadt continue to remember the day when horror visited their little town. Hauntstown Treasure. Many ghostly tales have been told about Calhoun County, an area divided by the Mississippi and Illinois rivers. Tales and legends speak of the ghosts of abandoned houses and forgotten graveyards, ghost lights, and eerie sounds that pierce the night skies. One such story tells of an old cabin that was once located near a place with the unlikely name of Hauntstown. According to the story, the cabin belonged to an old recluse named Jesse Barnes who, years before, had amassed a considerable fortune in the lumber business. It was said that he had owned several steamships and they made regular runs downstream to New Orleans. Jesse was also said to have been an eccentric, especially after his wife died in childbirth years before, and he distrusted banks and bankers. Because of this, he kept all of his money hidden at his home near Hauntstown. Neighbors in the area often talked about Barnes and his elusive treasure, although none of them knew for sure where he kept the money hidden. The old hermit was not a very friendly man and rarely allowed anyone on his property. Sometime prior to 1910, Jesse passed away, and the rumors once again began to circulate about his hidden fortune. The money had not been with the rest of his personal belongings, and most in the area were sure that it was still hidden somewhere on his property. One night, the Barnes cabin mysteriously burned to the ground. Many believe the fire may have been the work of looters, hoping to flush out the location of any gold coins secreted with the structure. Regardless, the blaze did not deter local folks from searching for the hidden loot. Other rumors also began to spread. Those who ventured out to the old Barnes cabin to look for the gold began to tell of a ghost who haunted the place. Most believed this spirit was that of Jesse Barnes, still trying to hide his money. Were these stories true? Or were they merely the creation of treasure hunters trying to keep other people away from the property? That much is unknown, but according to one story about a particular treasure hunt, it seems that supernatural forces may actually have been at work. One night, a small group of people came from the local settlement of Batchtown to look for the treasure. One of them, a woman named Elizabeth, had recently been to see a spiritualist medium. The medium had informed her that she was soon going to come into a large sum of money, which she would find hidden beneath a hearthstone for a fireplace. Excited, Elizabeth convinced 3 male companions to accompany her out to the site of the old Barnes cabin. She had heard the stories of the missing treasure and was sure this was the money she was due to discover. They arrived at the wooded cabin site very late in the evening. As they drove back along the winding, dirt road through the forest, they noticed the flicker of lightning in the dark sky. A thunderstorm was quickly approaching, so they knew they had to work fast, or face being trapped in the woods at the end of a washed-out and muddy road. Armed with shovels and a large lever, the group quickly got to work. They found the hearthstone amidst the ruins of the cabin. Save for the crumbling chimney, it was one of the only remaining structures from the house. After about an hour, they had dug far enough beneath the stone to begin to raise it up from the ground. The stone slowly rose a few inches, and as Elizabeth bent down to peer into the dark hole, she heard the sound of a moaning voice that seemed to be coming from beneath the stone. She sprang backwards and collided with the men who were levering the stone. They fell to the ground and the hearthstone pitched sideways, uncovering the hole underneath it. At that same moment, the sky overhead erupted with thunder and lightning and rain began to fall in sheets. The treasure hunters reeled back from the uncovered pit and, well, no one knows what they saw after that. None of the 4 members of the group ever spoke about what they saw that night. Whether or not the treasure, or something worse, rested in that hole remains a mystery. What we do know is that they managed to get down the dirt road through the forest before the rain washed it out completely, and after arriving home, they were never heard from again. The last trace of Elizabeth is a letter that she sent her mother from New Orleans. She never returned to Batchtown again. The following day, a neighbor who lived along a woods trail not far from the Barnes cabin decided to walk down to the old place. He was fairly sure that lightning had struck near the ruins of the cabin the night before and wanted to see what damage had been done. He later told, after hearing the story of the treasure hunters, that when he arrived at the remains of the house, he saw nothing out of place. The hearthstone was in the same place it had been the last time he had seen it, and as far as he could tell, it had never been moved. The neighbor also firmly stated that he did not believe in ghosts. So, what had they seen that night? Was the stone really moved out of place? Or was the secret of the missing fortune covered over by supernatural forces? No one can really say for sure. Of course, if the story is true, then this means that a fortune in hidden treasure may still be lying out there in the woods near the former site of Hauntstown, just waiting for someone to find it. The Diamond Island Mystery. The land along Illinois' rivers has long been plagued with weird stories and incidents that defy imagination. One of these strange tales involves the fiery phantom of Diamond Island, which was reported in the middle 1880s on a tiny island near Hardin, a small town between the Mississippi and Illinois rivers. The first report of the spook actually came in 1885 when two young men were fishing along the river one night. Shortly after midnight, a bright ball of light suddenly appeared on the small island, which was directly in front of them on the river. The ball of light, described as a fireball, shot through the trees and then flew up into the air, where it hung suspended over the island. The two boys ran home and awakened their parents to tell them about the eerie event. They insisted that they had actually seen a face within the ball of fire. Needless to say, their story was dismissed around town until other people, including a number of reputable town citizens, began to also report the strange light. It was about the size of a barrel and there were definite features in it, said one local businessman. I could see the shape of something fuzzy inside the fire. Finally, in September 1888, a group of skeptical locals banded together for an all-night hunt for the island phantom. Armed with guns, knives, clubs, and pitchforks, they rode out to the island in secrecy. They stayed as quiet as possible with the idea that if someone was hoaxing the weird events, they didn't want him to know they were there. The boats were hidden in the weeds along the riverbank, and the men quickly took cover at the edge of the trees. They were nervous, tense, and alert for any sign of the ghostly manifestation. Suddenly, the entire end of the island where they were hidden was bathed in a glowing red-orange light. An inexplicable ball of flame rose out of the trees, swooped into the air, and then simply hung above the men's heads. Their frightened cries echoed out over the water, and they raised their weapons and began firing at the glowing object. The shotguns and rifles had no effect on the strange light, and instead of fleeing, it moved even closer to the men. Finally, one of them shouted to run, and they all scrambled for the boats. What happened next was even more terrifying. Before the men could get to their boats, the fiery ball of light arced into the sky and landed inside the closest skiff. The boat plunged backward into the river and moved away from island. As it did so, the glowing light suddenly transformed into the shape of a small old man who was wearing a pair of denim overalls. He simply stood there in the boat for a few moments as it drifted out into the river, and then he was gone. The apparition seemed to catch fire and then, as a ball of light once again, it took off into the sky. It vanished quickly above the trees on the island. The would-be ghost hunters were terrified and trembling. They could not believe what they had seen. Some of them shouted to the shore for help while others fell to their knees and prayed. The cries from the island awakened a local farmer, who managed to rescue them, even though one of their boats still remained moored on the island. They were just too frightened to move, he later recalled. One of the boys had to be carried on and off my rowboat. The bizarre happenings continued on Diamond Island for several more months, much to the dismay of the local people. Then, like many other mysteries, the weird phenomena suddenly ceased without explanation. And Hardin's fiery phantom was never heard from again. Secrets of the Miles Mausoleum. One of the strangest and most eerie landmarks of southwestern Illinois is an abandoned mausoleum that looks out from the edge of Eagle Cliff toward the distant Mississippi River. The view from this towering bluff is a breathtaking one, and to stand in the doorway of the crumbling burial structure, one has to wonder why the dead would choose to give up such a vantage point for eternity. Although abandoned many years ago, the mausoleum stands strangely intact about 8 miles north of the small town of Valmeyer, at a place where Stephen W. Miles started a farm and established a grand estate like no other in the region. Stephen Miles was one of the most prominent settlers of southwestern Illinois. Born in New York in 1795, he received a liberal education. Miles studied music and was an accomplished performer on the violin. As a veteran of the War of 1812, he received land in Monroe County, Illinois, and he came to the state in 1819. He led a large group of fellow settlers down the Ohio River on flatboats, and they landed near Cave-in Rock. They brought along many head of livestock and wagons carrying farm equipment and household goods, but once they arrived in Illinois, they were lost. Trails leading from their landing place to Eagle Cliff were vague, remote, and hard to follow, but Miles carefully selected the better parts of the old trail, linked them with new pieces of road, and marked a route that was referred to for many years as Miles' Trace. After establishing a home near Eagle Cliff, Miles began to prosper and soon owned several thousand acres of fertile farmland in the region. He bought much of the land at the government office in Kaskaskia, and other land came from his purchase of claims of those who had settled on land and then made improvements. Tradition has it that these settlers, in conjunction with Miles, would come into the region and file on land they claimed for military service. The men would then disappear, sometimes mysteriously, shortly after transferring their claims to Miles. Today, only the abandoned mausoleum remains to remind us of the glory of the Miles estate. An inscription on the large marble panel to the right of the doorway informs visitors that it was built in 1858 by Stephen W. Miles, Esquire, the son of the elder Miles, as a memorial to the Miles family and their descendants. It was also stated that the mausoleum was to be cared for by the eldest son of each generation and to hold it, through this succession, in trust for the above family. The bankruptcy of the younger Miles, however, brought this plan to an end. The vault, which had been built to hold 56 family members, once housed only 11 bodies, those of Miles, his 2 wives, and other descendants. According to local tradition, even Miles' mistress and some servants were buried in the tomb. Back in the early 1960s, curiosity seekers who managed to find the mausoleum where it was hidden in the forest found that vandals and grave robbers had arrived first. Word spread, and even when Stephen's sister, Amanda Wheeler, died, she stated in her will that she was not to be buried in the mausoleum. She wanted to be buried in the surrounding cemetery and have a sturdy fence erected around her resting place. According to reports, the vaults inside of the crypt had been torn apart, scattering marble and broken wood from the caskets onto the floor. Visitors found numerous bones with pieces of dried flesh still clinging to them, cloth from burial shrouds, bits of glass from the coffins, and other assorted debris. Jewelry that had been buried with the remains had apparently been the incentive for the destruction. Believe it or not, things got worse. In the late 1960s, a cult group broke into the mausoleum and pulled the remaining bodies from the crypt. They defaced and destroyed the remaining vaults and then tossed the remains onto the ground outside. Attempting to raise the dead, or so they later said, they burned the corpses of Miles and his descendants, desecrating the area forever. Is it any wonder that the mausoleum has gained a reputation over the years for being haunted? Since that time, locals and members of the Miles Cemetery Association have cleaned up the mausoleum and the cemetery on the cliff. They have worked hard to preserve the site, where the father of the first governor of Illinois is buried, but they have been unable to discover just how many people are actually buried in the cemetery. The place is filled with unmarked graves, mostly due to vandalism over the years. Even so, in the daytime, this is a quiet and peaceful place. The problems still return after darkness falls, however, and even a dusk-to-dawn curfew sometimes fails to keep trouble away. The interior of the tomb is often marred by vandals' paint and by obscure messages that mean nothing to anyone other than those who left them. This is a weird and spooky place, and even those who do not believe in ghosts or hauntings will admit that the cemetery has a mysterious air about it. A number of accounts tell of shadowy figures that have been spotted on the grounds of the graveyard, and weird whimpers, cries, and sobs that have been heard in the darkness. There are also tales of strange sounds that come from the mausoleum itself, including voices and anguished moans. Mysterious lights have often been reported coming from the interior of the mausoleum after dark. These lights have often been seen from the road that runs far below the cliff, but no one has ever been found inside the crypt or even in the surrounding cemetery.